Welcome to this Campaign 2022 weekly reality check. I'm political specialist Shaun Boyd with our analyst, Democrat Mike Dino, Republican Dick Wadhams. An interesting poll out this week by the New York Times and Siena College shows this November's election may be much closer than expected. Despite 9.1% inflation and President Biden's 33% job approval rating, the poll found 41% of registered voters still prefer Democrats to control Congress versus 40% who prefer Republicans. Dick, I don't know, does this suggest that maybe abortion, the Supreme Court's abortion ruling, the recent mass shootings have taken hold here and are influencing voters?
That same poll, Shaun, also showed that abortion and gun control were way down in terms of the issues that people care about. But remember, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate will be decided by individual races in the states and in congressional districts. And in the competitive congressional districts, Democrats are very underwater. And that's the trouble, is that this poll does not reflect what's really going on the ground in terms of individual races across the country. And that's why Republicans, there's almost a foregone conclusion, Republicans win the House. The Senate is still up for grabs.
Mike, this is still good news for Democrats.
Well, I think it is promising because everybody's saying, woe is us. This is going to be a terrible year for Democrats in the midterm elections. And certainly there's a lot of shifting sands. I mean, the January 6th commission in the House continues to influence people's views on what's happening, in Washington and around the country. I do agree with Dick. I mean, it does come down to the individual House districts and the U.S. Senate races. And we're just getting through redistricting. Every 10 years, because of the census, everything's redrawn. Here in Colorado, we know we got a new seat. And it's one of the most competitive, the 8th Congressional District. And so one, depends on each district, and two, who's going to show up to vote. And in Colorado, we've been talking a lot about unaffiliated voters, and that's going to be a big key.
Election's still, 4 months away, so.
But 3 months from getting your ballot.
Right. So the poll also hints at shifting political allegiances. It shows Democrats have a 20-point lead over Republicans among white college-educated voters, while they have lost support among non-whites, specifically Hispanic working-class voters. The parties are essentially tied among Hispanics, a group that backed Democrats by nearly 50 points in the last midterm. Mike, what do you make of this?
Well, again, as I said, the shifting sands, I think that it all depends on who turns out to vote. Dick and I have been involved in a lot of campaigns, and you get polls and you look at numbers and you think, gosh, this looks good for us, but sometimes some of those demographics don't show up as much as you want them to. And the one that favors Democrats is that over 2/3 of suburban women are supporting Democrats, particularly where it is on the abortion rights issue. And I think that's a very promising number for Democrats in the November election.
After all, we have talked about women outvote vote men here in Colorado.
Right. Well, Democrats have taken Hispanics for granted for decades, and it's finally coming home to roost. And the Hispanics realize that Democrats don't care about inflation, they don't care about crime. In fact, they're responsible for those two things. And so Hispanic voters across the nation, and even along the Texas border with Mexico, there's been a huge shift towards Republicans along the Texas border. And so I think they're finally starting to realize that Democrats are not their friends, and that's why they're moving towards Republicans. In terms of the suburban women, I think by the time we hit the November election, those other issues of crime and inflation will be the issues we're talking about.
The poll did find among ethnic groups, Hispanics were most concerned about the economy and inflation. Right. While the 2024 presidential race is still a long way off, the poll suggests both President Biden and former President Trump may want to sit this one out. 64% of Democratic voters say they would prefer a new standard bearer in 2024, and nearly half of Republican primary voters would prefer someone other than Mr. Trump for president in 2024. Dick, thoughts?
I think that President Trump's numbers are going to continue to decline, even though the Washington Post reports today that he's about ready to get into the race. I think he must be panicking or something, that he needs to get back out there, which would be the worst thing for my party. But I do think that Republicans, they will end up wanting a new candidate. The other number in that poll, Shaun, 64% of Republicans under 35 want a different candidate than Trump.
Right.
The party ought to look at that very carefully, because those are voters that could leave the party if we nominate Trump again.
Mike, despite President Biden's low approval ratings, you still have voters saying, but still I'm willing to give Democrats a try, right?
Sure, but I mean, the issue, the hypothetical of Trump getting into the race before the midterms, it could be a game changer for the Democrats and for the president. I mean, the president largely got elected in a lot of ways because he wasn't Trump. And if Trump's back on the ballot, I think that improves Biden's chances. And interestingly enough, all countries have this issue of politicians being older than the average population. And I think that's one thing that we're not going to see change necessarily overnight. And so voters are still going to have choices of generational candidates, and they're going to have to make peace with that, I think.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, that is it for this week's Reality Check. We'll see you next week.